Sir, my mom didn't come home last night from a blind date. The single dad ran into the snow to find her. Before we continue, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Sienna Brooks was standing in front of her bathroom mirror, trying to remember how to look like a woman who had her life together instead of a single mom who hadn't been on a date in 2 years and was honestly terrified of the whole concept of romance after her ex-husband destroyed every ounce of trust she'd ever had. Her best friend Sophie had set this whole thing up, swearing up and down that this guy Jonah was different and kind and exactly what Sienna needed. But Sienna had heard that song before, and the last time she'd believed it, she'd ended up with a husband who traded her in for a younger model and left her drowning in debt with a 4-year-old daughter. Aubrey appeared in the doorway, wearing her favorite princess pajamas, and her eyes went wide like she was witnessing actual magic happening in their tiny apartment bathroom. "Mommy, you look like a princess from my storybooks." And Sienna felt tears prick her eyes because this little girl was the only reason she'd survived the last 2 years. The only thing that made waking up at 5 in the morning for double shifts worth it. She knelt down and kissed Aubrey's forehead, promising she'd be home by 9 or maybe 10 at the latest. And Aubrey grabbed her face with both tiny hands and said, "Find us a nice daddy, okay, Mommy?" With such innocent hope that Sienna almost canceled the whole date right then and there. The teenage babysitter from next door arrived right on time, and Sienna gave her approximately 47 instructions about bedtime and snacks and emergency numbers before finally forcing herself out the door into the cold February evening with snow just starting to fall. She drove to Maple Street Cafe, telling herself this was just coffee and conversation. No pressure, no expectations, just one normal night where she got to feel like a human being instead of a bill-paying, sleep-deprived survival machine. Across town, Jonah Mitchell was having his own crisis of confidence, while his 8-year-old son Owen watched him try on 3 different shirts, like it actually mattered what he wore to a date he didn't even want to go on. His sister Amanda had basically threatened to disown him if he didn't show up tonight, saying 3 years was long enough to grieve, and Melissa would have wanted him to be happy again. And maybe she was right, but that didn't make it hurt any less. 3 years since the accident, 3 years since that phone call that ripped his entire world apart, 3 years since he'd held his wife's hand in a hospital room and watched the monitors go flat. Owen tugged on his sleeve and said, "Dad, you're doing the sad face again." And Jonah forced a smile because his kid had already lost his mom at 5 years old, and he didn't need to watch his father fall apart every time someone mentioned moving on. Owen told him maybe this lady would be cool and that he needed a girlfriend because he was boring now. And Jonah couldn't even argue with that assessment because the kid was absolutely right. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the cafe, telling himself one date wouldn't kill him, one conversation with a stranger couldn't possibly make things worse than they already were. Sienna arrived first and chose a table by the window where she could watch the snow fall and pretend she wasn't nervously shredding a napkin into tiny pieces under the table. Then Jonah walked in, and something shifted in her chest because he was taller than his pictures and his eyes had this depth to them that said he'd been through something real, something that left marks. He spotted her and smiled, actually smiled like meeting her was the best thing that had happened to him all week, and Sienna felt herself relax for the first time in months. The conversation flowed easier than she'd expected, both of them laughing about the disasters of single parenting and trading stories about their kids like they'd known each other for years instead of minutes. Sienna told him about Aubrey being 6 going on 30, with opinions about everything from breakfast cereal to world politics. And Jonah told her about Owen, who apparently considered himself his father's personal life coach and had very strong feelings about his dad's social life. An hour disappeared like magic, and Sienna realized she was actually enjoying herself, actually feeling that flutter in her stomach that she'd forgotten existed. Then her phone rang, and everything shattered when the babysitter's panicked voice came through saying there was a family emergency, and she had to leave right now. Her grandmother was in the hospital. She was so sorry, but she couldn't stay. Sienna's heart dropped into her stomach as she apologized to Jonah and explained she had to go immediately. And he offered to drive her, but she said her car was close, and she didn't want to make him leave his coffee. And honestly, she was already calculating how fast she could get home to Aubrey. She asked for a rain check with genuine hope in her voice, telling him she hadn't felt this comfortable with anyone in years, and she really wanted to see him again. And Jonah watched her rush out into the snow, already planning their second date in his head. He finished his coffee slowly, texted her that he hoped everything was okay and he'd had a great time, then drove home feeling lighter than he had in 3 years, because maybe Amanda was right. Maybe it was finally time to start living again. Sienna was hurrying through the snowy parking lot when she saw the car that had slid off the icy road into a telephone pole, and she saw the teenage boy inside bleeding and scared and trapped behind a crushed dashboard. She didn't think, didn't hesitate, just ran toward him because that's who she was. The kind of person who couldn't walk past someone in pain without trying to help. She called 911 while keeping the kid calm, staying with him until the paramedics arrived, and she was helping them clear a path when her feet hit a patch of black ice, and the world tilted sideways. Her head cracked against the frozen pavement, and everything went dark, her phone shattering under the wheel of the ambulance that was trying to save the boys she'd stopped to help. The paramedics found her unconscious and bleeding and loaded her in alongside the teenager, her purse still locked in her car with all her identification, nobody knowing who she was or who might be waiting for her to come home. Aubrey waited on the couch watching the door, like if she stared hard enough her mommy would appear. But 9 o'clock came and went, and then 10 o'clock, and then 11. And eventually her eyes got too heavy and she fell asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit with the door still locked and the apartment still empty. Morning light woke her up, and she checked her mommy's room with hope fading into fear when she found the bed still made and the apartment still silent. And that's when Aubrey decided she wasn't going to sit here and cry like a baby because she was 6 years old and she remembered her mommy saying Maple Street Cafe, and she knew exactly where Maple Street was. She put on her coat and her boots and her mittens because mommy always said to dress warm when it was snowing. And she walked out into the cold morning air, determined to find her mother no matter what it took. Jonah was sitting in that same cafe, nursing his second cup of coffee and checking his phone for a response that never came when a little girl pushed through the door, looking frozen and scared and completely alone. Mrs. Holloway rushed over asking where her parents were, and the girl looked up with tears in her eyes and said the words that made Jonah's blood run cold. "My mommy came here last night for a date, and she never came home. Can you help me find her?" Jonah stood up slowly because brown hair and blue dress and last night were echoing in his skull, and he walked over and knelt down to this shivering child and asked what her mommy's name was. The little girl said Sienna Brooks, and Jonah's entire world stopped spinning because the woman he'd spent last night falling for had never made it home, and her 6-year-old daughter had walked through the snow alone to find help. He took Aubrey's frozen hands in his and said, "I'm Jonah. I was your mommy's date last night, and I'm going to find her." And the trust that flooded into this child's eyes nearly broke him in half. He bundled her into his truck, cranked the heat as high as it would go, and drove into the snow to search for the woman he'd only just met, but somehow already couldn't imagine losing. Jonah drove through the snow-covered streets with one hand on the wheel and one eye on the rearview mirror, where Aubrey sat clutching her hot chocolate like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to this world. He'd called Amanda and asked her to pick up Owen from school because he wasn't going anywhere until he found this little girl's mother, and Amanda had heard something in his voice that made her agree without asking questions. The cafe parking lot where Sienna had left her car was their first stop, and when Jonah saw her vehicle still sitting there covered in fresh snow, his stomach dropped because there was no good reason for that car to still be here 12 hours later. Aubrey pressed her face against the truck window and said, "That's Mommy's car. Why didn't she drive it home?" And Jonah didn't have an answer that wouldn't terrify a 6-year-old, so he just squeezed her hand and told her they were going to figure this out together. He walked around the parking lot looking for any clue while Aubrey waited in the warm truck, and that's when he noticed the scrape marks on the telephone pole at the edge of the lot. The kind of marks that came from a car hitting it hard enough to leave paint behind. The gas station attendant across the street remembered the accident when Jonah described what he was looking for. Said there'd been a big commotion last night with ambulances and police in a car wrapped around that pole over there. Jonah asked if there was a woman involved, brown hair, maybe wearing a blue dress, and the attendant shrugged, saying he just saw the lights from inside, but the ambulances went to County General if that helped. Jonah thanked him and ran back to the truck where Aubrey was waiting, with eyes full of questions he couldn't answer yet. They drove to County General first because it was closest, and Jonah's hands were shaking on the steering wheel in a way he hadn't felt since the night he'd gotten the call about Melissa 3 years ago. He pushed that memory down hard because he couldn't fall apart right now. Not with this little girl counting on him, not when Sienna might be lying in a hospital bed somewhere, wondering why nobody had come for her. The emergency room receptionist checked her computer and said there was no Sienna Brooks in their system, and Jonah felt hope and despair fighting for space in his chest. Aubrey tugged on his jacket and asked if her mommy wasn't here. Then where was she? And Jonah knelt down to her level and promised they would check every hospital in the city if they had to. The second hospital was the same story. No record of anyone by that name. And Jonah was starting to feel the edges of panic creeping in when they pulled up to Memorial Medical Center, and the woman at the front desk said something that made his heart stop beating. "We have a Jane Doe who came in last night from a car accident. No identification on her. She's been unconscious until about an hour ago." Jonah described Sienna in as much detail as he could remember, and the nurse's eyes widened in recognition. Said that sounded like the woman in room 412, who'd finally woken up but couldn't remember much about what happened. Aubrey was already pulling on Jonah's hand, trying to drag him toward the elevators. And when the nurse asked if they were family, Aubrey looked up with those big, desperate eyes and said, "He's going to be my new daddy. Please let us see my mommy." The nurse melted like butter in a hot pan and led them down the hallway to room 412, where Jonah could see through the window a woman lying in a hospital bed with a bandage wrapped around her head. Aubrey broke free from his grip and burst through the door screaming, "Mommy!" at the top of her lungs, and Sienna's eyes flew open with confusion that shifted to pure relief when she saw her daughter launching herself onto the bed. Jonah stood in the doorway watching this reunion with tears streaming down his face that he didn't even try to hide, because this woman was alive, and her daughter had found her, and somehow, against all odds, everything was going to be okay. Sienna looked up from hugging Aubrey and saw Jonah standing there, and her face cycled through about 15 emotions in 3 seconds flat. "You're here. How are you here? How did you find me?" And Jonah walked over to the bed and sat down on the edge because his legs weren't working properly anymore. He explained that Aubrey had walked through the snow to the cafe looking for help and found him instead. And Sienna's eyes went huge as she looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. "You walked there alone? Baby, that's almost a mile. You could have frozen. You could have gotten lost. You could have..." But Aubrey just shrugged like walking through a snowstorm to find her mother was no big deal and said she remembered Mommy saying Maple Street Cafe, and she knew exactly where that was because they walked past it going to school. Sienna was crying and laughing and holding Aubrey so tight it looked almost painful, and Jonah sat there watching them, feeling something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 3 years. Sienna finally caught her breath enough to explain what happened. The babysitter's emergency and rushing out and seeing the car wrapped around the telephone pole with a teenage boy trapped inside. She couldn't just drive past, couldn't leave him there alone and scared and bleeding, so she stopped to help and called 911 and stayed with him until the ambulances came. She was helping the paramedics when she slipped on the ice and hit her head so hard everything went black, woke up in this hospital bed with no phone and no ID and no memory of how she got here. Jonah felt the blood drain from his face when she said car accident, because those words had haunted him for 3 years, ever since a drunk driver had run a red light and taken Melissa away from him forever. But then he really heard what Sienna was saying, that she'd stopped to help, that she'd risked her own safety to save a stranger, that the thing that had destroyed his life was something she'd run toward instead of away from. His wife had been killed by an accident, and this woman had almost died trying to prevent one. And something about that symmetry hit him so hard he couldn't breathe. Sienna noticed his face had gone pale and asked if he was okay. And Jonah found himself telling her about Melissa for the first time since it happened. The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam. The phone call and the hospital and the moment when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. He told her about Owen losing his mother at 5 years old and barely remembering her now, about 3 years of going through the motions and feeling guilty every time he smiled because it felt like betraying his wife's memory. Sienna reached out and took his hand with tears running down her cheeks, saying she was so sorry, that Melissa sounded like an incredible woman who was just trying to get home to her family. Jonah looked at this woman who'd almost died because she couldn't drive past someone who needed help and said, "You could have saved her. If you'd been there that night, you would have stopped." Sienna squeezed his hand and said, "That's what good people do. They stop. They help. They don't just drive by and pretend they didn't see." Amanda arrived an hour later with Owen in tow because she'd heard enough from the phone calls to know something important was happening, and she wasn't missing it. Owen walked into the hospital room and saw Aubrey and immediately appointed himself her official protector, telling her that her mom was going to be fine because his dad fixed everything, and that's just what dads do. Aubrey looked at Jonah and then at Owen and then back at Jonah with something like hope blooming in her eyes. Mrs. Holloway showed up with enough food to feed an army because word had spread and she wasn't about to let this family go hungry during a crisis. She looked around the room at all these people who'd been strangers 24 hours ago and said, "This is what my cafe was built for, bringing people together when they need it most." Sienna watched Jonah help Aubrey open her sandwich and saw the way Owen made her daughter laugh for the first time all day. And she thought maybe this is what family could feel like. Maybe this is what she'd been missing all along. The doctor came in and said Sienna could go home in the morning as long as someone was there to watch for concussion symptoms. And before Sienna could figure out the logistics, Jonah said she was coming home with him because there was no way he was letting her and Aubrey go back to an empty apartment after everything that had happened. Sienna tried to protest, but Aubrey was already asking Owen if they really had a dog like he'd mentioned. And Owen was promising to introduce her to Max the golden retriever, who was going to love her immediately. Sienna looked at Jonah with something between gratitude and wonder, asking why he was doing all this for someone he'd just met. And Jonah took her hand and said, "Because some people are worth showing up for, and I've spent 3 years forgetting how to show up for anyone." She leaned back against her pillow, still holding his hand, and for the first time since the accident, she felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. 2 weeks at Jonah's house turned Sienna's entire understanding of what life could look like completely upside down in the best possible way. She'd spent so long surviving on her own that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone bring her coffee in the morning or make sure she took her pain medication on time, or just sit with her on the couch watching terrible reality TV because her head hurt too much for anything that required actual thinking. Aubrey and Owen had become inseparable from day one, running around the backyard with Max the golden retriever like they'd been siblings their whole lives instead of strangers who'd met in a hospital room. Sienna kept trying to find excuses to go back to her apartment because she felt guilty taking up space in someone else's home. But Jonah kept finding reasons for her to stay that were so flimsy they were almost laughable. He said Owen needed help with his reading, and Aubrey was really good at that. Said the roads were still icy and driving wasn't safe. Said Max would be devastated if Aubrey left because the dog had clearly chosen her as his favorite human. They both knew he was making excuses, and neither of them cared because the truth was she didn't want to leave, and he didn't want her to go. She cooked dinner one night as a thank you for everything he'd done, standing in his kitchen like she belonged there, while Aubrey helped Owen set the table, and the dog weaved between everyone's legs, hoping for dropped food. Jonah stood in the doorway, watching this scene that looked so much like the family he'd lost 3 years ago, except it didn't hurt the way he expected it to. It felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding something he didn't know he'd been searching for until it was right in front of his face. A month after the accident, Jonah asked Sienna on a proper date. Not a blind date set up by well-meaning friends, but a real intentional choice to spend an evening together as two people who were definitely falling for each other. Amanda agreed to watch both kids with a knowing smile that said she'd been waiting for this moment since the second she'd walked into that hospital room and seen the way her brother looked at Sienna. They went back to Maple Street Cafe because it felt right, sitting at the same table where everything had started just a few weeks ago. Mrs. Holloway gave them the best booth and refused to let them pay for anything, saying she'd been waiting 30 years to witness a love story this good, and she wasn't about to ruin it by charging them for pasta. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, about their kids and their fears and their hopes for the future. And when Jonah walked her to the door at the end of the night, he kissed her for the first time, It was soft and slow and worth every second of waiting, and from the living room window they could hear Owen yelling, "Aubrey, he kissed her," and Aubrey responding, "I knew it would happen," like two tiny matchmakers celebrating their successful scheme. Everything was perfect for exactly 2 months before Sienna's past came crashing back into her present in the form of her ex-husband David, showing up unannounced at her apartment demanding to know why she'd moved in with some random guy. Someone had told him she was seeing someone, and suddenly after 2 years of complete silence, he wanted to be involved again. Not because he actually cared about Aubrey, but because he couldn't stand the idea of another man raising his daughter. He threatened custody issues and called her an unfit mother for letting their child walk through the snow alone to a cafe, using her worst moment against her like a weapon. Sienna was shaking when Jonah found her sitting on the porch trying to hold herself together, and she told him everything through tears that wouldn't stop falling. David had destroyed her once before, and now he was going to take Aubrey away because she'd made one mistake on the worst night of her life, and there was nothing she could do to stop him because he had money and lawyers and she had nothing but 2 jobs and a mountain of debt. Jonah pulled her close and said, "Over my dead body," with a conviction that made her believe him. The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations and paperwork, and building a case that proved Sienna was the parent who had actually been there for the last 2 years. Amanda knew family court from her work as a social worker and offered to help for free, gathering evidence of David's complete absence from Aubrey's life. They documented every missed birthday and ignored phone call and unpaid child support payment, building a picture of a man who only wanted his daughter when someone else was loving her better than he ever had. The social worker who interviewed Aubrey asked her about that night, and the little girl told the truth with the kind of clarity that only children possess. She said her mommy never left her alone on purpose, that it was an accident because mommy was helping someone who got hurt, and that she'd walked to the cafe because she knew her mommy would want her to be brave. The social worker asked who she wanted to live with, and Aubrey said, "My mommy and Jonah and Owen and Max," like they were already a family unit that couldn't be separated. David's case fell apart completely when they discovered he was behind on child support payments to another woman with 2 other kids he'd also abandoned, proving a pattern that the judge found very interesting. The custody hearing lasted less than an hour before the judge awarded full custody to Sienna with a scathing assessment of David's sudden interest in fatherhood that only appeared when another man entered the picture. Sienna cried in the courthouse hallway while Jonah held her, and she looked up at him and said, "We did it." And he smiled and said, "You did it. I just held your hand." 6 months later, Sienna and Aubrey officially moved into Jonah's house with boxes that didn't take long to unpack because neither of them had ever accumulated much in the way of possessions. Aubrey got her own room next to Owen's, and they spent an entire weekend painting it together, dinosaurs on Owen's walls because he'd apparently inherited his father's taste, and butterflies on Aubrey's because she said they reminded her of the day everything changed. Family dinners became a nightly thing, and Sienna couldn't believe she'd spent so long thinking she had to do everything alone when this kind of love had been waiting for her all along. The anniversary of the night Sienna disappeared came around faster than anyone expected, and Jonah took her back to Maple Street Cafe for dinner, while Amanda watched the kids with strict instructions not to wait up. Mrs. Holloway kept bringing champagne and giving Sienna knowing looks that made her suspicious. And when Jonah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, Sienna's hands flew to her mouth because she knew exactly what was happening. He told her that 1 year ago she'd walked out of this cafe, and he'd thought he might never see her again. But then her daughter had walked through the snow and found him, and everything changed. He said Aubrey had taught him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, and Sienna had taught him that love after loss wasn't a betrayal, but a gift. He asked her to marry him with tears in his eyes, and she said yes before he even finished the question. And Mrs. Holloway appeared with more champagne, yelling, "I knew it," loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. They got married in the cafe 6 months later, with Owen as the ring bearer and Aubrey as the flower girl clutching a bouquet and the stuffed rabbit she still slept with every night. Both kids had written their own vows to their new family. Aubrey thanking Jonah for finding her mommy in the snow and being the daddy she'd wished for. Owen thanking Sienna for making his dad smile again and for making better pancakes than anyone in the entire world. The 4 of them held hands at the altar while Mrs. Holloway cried into her apron and Amanda took approximately 1,000 photographs. 1 year after the wedding, they were all standing in the backyard watching the first snow of the season fall, while Max ran in circles trying to catch flakes on his tongue. Aubrey yelled for Mom and Dad to come help build a snowman, and Sienna looked at Jonah with wonder in her eyes because her daughter had said, "Dad," like it was the most natural thing in the world. Jonah's eyes were wet as he took Sienna's hand, and they ran into the snow together. This family that had been built from tragedy and blind dates and one brave little girl who refused to give up. Sometimes the worst night of your life leads you exactly where you need to be. Sienna walked into a cafe hoping to find love and ended up in a hospital bed, but her daughter walked into that same cafe and found the man who would become her father. Jonah thought one blind date couldn't change anything and discovered that love finds you when you're finally brave enough to let it. If this story reminded you that asking for help isn't weakness and that family is who shows up when everything falls apart, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to believe that second chances are real.